Good morning. On behalf of the University of Pittsburgh College of Business Administration, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Power of Persuasion, Exerting Influence Without Authority. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. All callers have been muted to prevent background noise. There will be a question and answer segment at the conclusion of today's webinar. If you have a question about any of the material presented today, simply submit a question via the Q&A tab in the WebEx event window found on the right side of your screen. We will attempt to answer all questions at the end of the webinar. However, we may run out of time. Please ask your questions early so that we can get them queued up and ready to go. You may move the presentation to a full screen view by clicking on this option at the bottom of the WebEx event window. If you move to a full screen view, you will be able to toggle between the full screen presentation and the WebEx event window by using the buttons located on the small WebEx toolbar located at the top of your screen. This toolbar will also give you access to the Q&A window. Today's event is being recorded. You will be able to view the recording at www.cba.pitt.edu/webinars. We are joined today by R. David Lebel, a professor at the University of Pittsburgh Joseph M. Katz Graduate School of Business and College of Business Administration. Please enjoy today's event. We will control the movement of the slides. Some slides are graphic intense and may take some time to advance, depending on the speed of your connection. At this time, I will turn over the event to Professor Lebel.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me. Today we're going to talk about how to influence and use persuasion tactics when you don't have formal authority. And I think this is a good topic for many of us on the line, many of you who are maybe internship experience or just new recent college graduates with only 1 or 2 years of experience where you don't have a lot of formal authority or formal status in an organization, but yet you have to work with coworkers and peers and try to get them to work with you to achieve some goals. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Give you a little background on my experience just to set this up. I have a background in organizational behavior. I went to the Wharton School of Business, studied management, and I got my PhD in organizational behavior. I study things like communication, speaking up at work, coming up with new ideas, innovative ideas, how people are more effective at doing those types of behaviors, at being innovative, at speaking up. Also emotions. I focus some research on anger in the workplace, fear, like fear of losing your job. And some of these things certainly come into play for many of us when we're trying to speak up and influence others. It can be an anxiety-ridden event, and so we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the session. And some of my work experience. So after I graduated as an undergraduate and before I got my PhD, I worked as a business analyst for a very large supply chain company. It was a rotational program, got to see very different aspects of the company like procurement, supply chain, transportation, that type of thing. And then I was also a consultant with Deloitte in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years doing analytical work, lots of work with Excel, spreadsheets. Again, a little bit with supply chain, but also with some government organizations. And I mentioned that experience because it's useful. It was when I was right out of college, when I was like 22, 23, 24. And in those situations, didn't have formal authority. I was just a first-year associate, a first-year analyst. And one of the examples that I can recall from my very first job, I was a procurement analyst. I was basically looking at or measuring supply and demand of groceries. Groceries like Procter & Gamble's, like Tide, like detergent, like Cheerios from General Mills. And I had to have enough supply of all those products on hand for any sale going on at grocery stores, like, your local Giant Eagle. And one day, I was all ready for a typical Wednesday, whatever day of the week it was, and, got into my office around 7:30, and at 8:15 in the morning, I get a call from a warehouse manager saying that they could not accept $8,000 worth of inventory. They said, we can't use this. It's not going to be able to go out for this sale. And this big sale was starting the very next day, and $8,000 worth of laundry detergent is quite a bit. So this is not the beginning I wanted to have. This is not the start of the day I wanted to have. And so I'm asking the guy, why can't you accept it? What's the problem with this inventory? And I was trying to tell him we have a sale tomorrow. This is really important. And I realized that on the phone that we were at an impasse and this wasn't going to go very far. So I had to figure out how to influence this person. So I'm going to leave it at that for a cliffhanger for a little bit later and tell you later on, after we go through some of the recommendations for influencing, about how I effectively dealt with that situation. And it will come out of some of the topics that we're talking about here today. But in this situation, I was very frustrated. I was annoyed. It caught me off guard. And yet I had to deal with someone who was more senior than I was and had to get an effective resolution. So we'll talk about how to do that today. So the goals for today, like I said, how to influence others when you don't have formal status or formal authority in an organization, how to develop very specific communication skills for when you're dealing with those challenging co-workers and colleagues. We've all dealt with those situations, so what are some specific communication tactics that you can use in those situations? And we're going to talk about how using forms of powerless speech actually can be more effective than using very assertive or powerful speech. And we'll talk about the situations when that is the case and how to use that certain style of speech. And then we'll talk about something that I think is useful for all people who are early in their careers. We all need to seek feedback, ask for help, gain knowledge, and get training and skills. But how do you do that without reputational costs? You know, how do I ask for help and seek feedback without seeming maybe weak or seeming like I'm not a very high performer at work? So we'll talk about how to do that, because we all need to get that type of information, get that feedback, but how do you do that, especially when you're early on in your career? So those are our goals for today. So I'll start off by talking about this concept of the power of powerless speech. So imagine, like the picture on the slide here, that you're in a group and it's part of a simulation. You could be a group of MBA students, a group of undergraduate students, and your task is you've been told that you were on a helicopter and the helicopter crashed, and you have to decide, pick out a bunch of items from the wreckage to get safely to the bottom of the mountain, right? So this is an exercise in teamwork, something that we all face every day in real situations at work. So you're working with your peers to figure out the best way to rescue all of you and get safely down the mountain. And this is a common exercise here at CBA and many business programs, MBA programs across the country. So the question here is, who is seen as the most trustworthy, the one as the most likely leader of this group of 5 or 6 people trying to figure out the best way to survive in this task? And this is a really clever study. It looked at the communication that people used during the group interaction, deciding which set of random items you should use to get down the mountain. So this researcher at the University of North Carolina had some people be more assertive. And those people would say things like, the flashlight needs to be rated higher. It is the only reliable night signaling device. So very direct, very to the point, very assertive, what we typically think of in terms of using influence. But then to another group of people, or to half the groups in this experiment, they had people communicate in a different way. And this person would say things like, do you think the flashlight should maybe be rated higher? It may be a pretty reliable night signaling device. So there you see things like that we call hedges. Maybe this would work. You see some questions, asking a question to the group rather than being direct and assertive. And what this experiment showed, and at the end of this exercise, it was about like a 45-minute, hour-long group exercise, they asked everyone in the group to rate everybody else. Who did you trust the most? Who did you like the most? Who would you see as a good leader? And it turns out that the people using this form of communication, this latter form, the one with questions, the less direct, the less assertive language, were actually rated as better coworkers, better leaders, and more trustworthy. And this is really important for most of us on the webinar today. This task was done with people of the same age, so it was peers in your cohort, whether you were a junior in college or you were a first-year MBA student. Right? It was all people of the same age, same background, same education, with no formal titles. Right? So nobody had a higher level of status in the group than anybody else, so it kind of emerged. And that's what most of us are dealing with when we're on peer-to-peer groups or working with others. they don't have this formal status or authority, and it turns out that when you use that less assertive language, you are seen in higher regard or viewed in higher regard in terms of trustworthiness and leadership by your peers, even though you don't have any formal authority. So that's really important to consider, that you can potentially switch up your style of communication in these more peer, interdependent work group tasks, which many of us out of business school start off in. So what are these aspects of powerless speech? If you wanted to adopt this style, what are some things that you could do and use? One thing is things we call hedges. When people say kind of, sort of, maybe, probably, I think. So you're not being as assertive, right? You're kind of hedging the way you're speaking up. Disclaimers. This idea may be way out there. You know, if you're in a meeting, you're not sure how to speak up initially, you might want to say, you know, this idea is coming out of left field. I don't know what you guys will think, but hey, here's some data I have. Here's an idea that I have, right? So you're less assertive, and actually people, especially people of similar status or similar peer groups, respond better to more of those disclaimers. And the same thing with tag questions, especially when there's uncertainty and you're not maybe so sure, you can ask questions like, you know, that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought of that. Or what do you think? You can kind of ask more questions that are less assertive, that get people involved, and others really respect that. So the takeaway is that maybe, perhaps, you should consider speaking more tentatively at work, especially when you're in these peer-to-peer work groups working on a similar task where there's no really rigid formal authority or rigid structure, because these forms of communication can be more effective in those settings. One aspect of influence that goes relatively unused and relatively unnoticed is actually the power of asking questions. Taking what you think of as assertive statements and thinking about how to frame them as a question. It's less direct, and it actually works a lot better in terms of influence in many different scenarios. Just asking, whether it be a client, if you are a consultant, or if you're an auditor dealing with clients, just starting off a meeting by, tell me a little bit more about what you do on a daily basis. Tell me a little bit more about how this group project is going, or this particular task is going. Just getting them to open up a little bit more is actually a form of influence. Just by asking questions, you'll gain a lot of information by having them talk. And people love to hear themselves talk, so giving them the chance to open up, it makes them feel more comfortable around you, more trusting of you, and you'll gain a lot more information just by starting off with a leading question. And this works for more even quantitative sales environments, bottom line sales actually. So a great study of 40,000 people, it's a classic study in marketing. And they sent out a survey, and they called some people, and a phone interview, and it was, you know, just to get their interest in a bunch of random topics. And so they call 40,000 people out of the blue. And one question, you know, as a part of this 5-minute survey is, you know, have you considered thinking about purchasing a new car in the next 6 months? You know, people say, I don't know, I hadn't even thought about that. Maybe, yes, no. And they found out that just asking the question led to a 1% increase in sales over the next 6 months. And that might not seem like a lot, but if you're talking about car sales across the country, if you're talking about car sales in this study, which was 40,000 people, that's 400 more car sales. I mean, that's a big bonus for those people selling those cars, and all it took was just asking a question. So what's going on here? Just asking the question put the idea in the other person's mind. They probably hadn't thought about purchasing a car, and you literally just planted the seed. And obviously this doesn't work all the time. It's not like they got to 100% of car sales, but in a lot of things we do, just moving people by 1% or 5%, especially in sales, in a new business, or if you're an entrepreneur, you know, that's a big deal, getting 1 to 5% more sales. And it all takes sometimes just asking questions. So why does this work? Well, when you're asking questions, this does not seem like you're trying to manipulate anybody. You don't come off as the real sleazy salesperson type. So when you ask questions, it actually lowers people's defense systems, right? As soon as you're being more assertive as a salesperson, sometimes people put their shields up and say, you know what, I'm not really interested in this today. But if you can frame it in terms of a question, right, they don't see it as an overt influence attempt. And the same thing actually happens at work. If you're in a meeting and things are getting heated, if you ask questions rather than make very declarative, assertive statements, people won't see it as threatening, right? They won't think that they have to oppose you as much when you can frame things in the form of a question. And again, this works very well with peers, because again, sometimes there's that uncertainty of who's jockeying to be a leader, but by just asking questions, you can disarm most people in the audience, right? And they're not going to be on as edge, and they're not going to feel as threatened. So asking questions in many ways is just a way in to get people to open up and to consider your points of view. And this leads to a broader point that I've been getting at, that there are two broad styles of communication you can use in everyday life at work and also for influence. And we're pretty familiar with both of them. The first is advocacy, and this is what you see on the slides in front of you. This is more of your assertive styles of speech, persuasion, lobbying, trying to get your way. It's also not just a communication style, it's a way of thinking. It's going into a meeting thinking that it's going to be my idea that wins and nothing else, right? It's that way of thinking, which many times that's how we go into meetings. We want to influence others. We want to get our way. We want to win that negotiation, right? And that's advocacy, right? You're trying to persuade. You kind of inside your head thinking like, my way is right, I'm going to get others to move to my way of thinking about things, whatever problem it might be. A salary discussion, how to go for, a planning meeting for a consulting project. You're going in thinking, I'm going to get the others to agree with what I have to say. And the other style that I've been talking about today is inquiry. And this starts with being just more inquisitive, asking more questions. Being a little bit more critical in terms of thinking. You're trying to get answers to questions rather than trying to think about, I'm going to be right and I need to get others to be convinced by what I have to say. Here you're asking more questions, you're open to alternatives, and you're willing to realize that maybe I don't have all the information. Maybe there's more to this argument than I realized, so you're at least open to the notion that there's something else going on. Maybe there's something else we need to look into, and maybe we need more of a debate rather than everyone trying to get their way and trying to win. So these are two styles. We use both of these. We switch up, but we have a predominant tendency. Each of us tends to use one style versus the other. And that's limiting. We actually need to use both. To be most effective in terms of influence and persuading others, you actually need to use both of these. There are times, let's say you're the expert or you're the most knowledgeable. Yeah, there are times when you should be the advocate. You should use advocacy. But a lot of times in consulting, auditing, finance, banking, the answer isn't always that simple, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and in those situations you need more inquiry to ask questions. And so for most of us, especially here in the United States, where we're trained and taught culturally to be more of to use more of an advocacy style, it's very helpful to temper that sometimes and use a little bit more of a balance. It's essential to use a balance if you really, truly want to be most effective at work in terms of persuasion. You want to be able to use both of these styles. So for most of us on the line, we're thinking about, wait, most of the times I'm trying to be an advocate where I feel that I have to be assertive and I have to feel powerful. And the thinking here is that maybe that's not the case. Maybe there are times where I can actually be more influential by being less assertive. And a couple of reasons for that is that there are some drawbacks to being too assertive, to using too much advocacy. One reason is that if I'm using advocacy and you're using advocacy, a competition emerges and we're just fighting. And most of the people in a group or team can see that. Oh, here we go. These two people are trying to jockey and fight for leadership positions. But it's really tough to actually gain influence in that situation. It just leads to a lot of conflict. And what you end up getting is tennis, right? Think of the sport of tennis, just hitting the ball back and forth. I'm right, no, I'm right. I'm right, no, I'm right. And that's a good metaphor here. When there's too much advocacy, nothing's really changing. Everyone's kind of digging in, sticking to their guns, and sticking to their side of the story. And when you want to win in that situation and others just want to win, you actually may not make any progress. You just might get people more anchored to their initial position. And this actually creates power imbalances. And so when people have their shields up, when there's too much advocacy, that actually creates fewer opportunities for persuasion, for actual influence, because everyone's kind of guarded and more defensive. And so when you have too much advocacy, it actually creates less and fewer opportunities for you to gain influence. So there are downsides to being too assertive and using too much advocacy. So what does inquiry look like? We've kind of talked about this a little bit with powerless speech, but very specifically, you want to use questions to get an understanding of where other people are coming from. Help me understand your perspective. Can you tell me a little bit more about the data that you received or the data that you collected? Help me understand your perspective. And you might use some, again, hedging language. Say, maybe it's just me. I think I'm just slow today. I'm confused by this point. Could you help me out a little bit? Could you educate me a little bit more? And that's less threatening, right? You're asking a question. You're kind of putting the emphasis on yourself. Oh, maybe I'm not catching up on this. Maybe I'm a little slow, right? And so it's a lot less assertive, right? And it puts people off guard rather than on guard, right? And it gives you more information. It gives you more time to think by asking questions, because the other person will be talking. You can reflect and think about the information that they're providing. At the same time, you do need to be open and make your thinking visible. Well, okay, that's really interesting, your perspective. I hadn't thought of that, but here's where I'm coming from, right? Here's where I got my data. Here's how I'm seeing it. And it's really interesting where you're coming from, but maybe this is an alternative viewpoint or even maybe a complementary viewpoint to what you just presented. Right, and so you want to establish where you're coming from. And if you are the expert, this is a good time to do it, not assertively necessarily, and just say, I've had a lot of experience in this area, or we've collected a lot of data, or we've dealt with a lot of similar customers on this issue in the past, and here's what we found. And that gives you a way to less assertively establish that, maybe you do have a lot of factual information that others don't have, and they should listen to you more. And again, it's being a little bit less direct that provides a way and inroads to gain some influence rather than being very direct and assertive. So why use more inquiry? If I haven't convinced you enough yet, I think this is a great example of something that I've been thinking about a lot about in terms of communication. Just think about the use of social media today. It could be politics. Think back to the presidential election and all the issues that have arisen, whether it be immigration. It could even be, I've seen this with work issues that I post about online, whether it be work-family conflict, time off, use of vacation time. I'm amazed at how many people go off on these topics and get really angry and take a position. So when we think about social media, like, why does this happen? Well, let's think about this for a second. What happens when we get frustrated or angry with another person's post or tweet? Think for a second about how you respond. It's the end of the workday, you've had a long day, and you see some post about the president or a post about Republicans or post about Democrats, whatever side you're on, and it's like, I can't believe that, right? And you just go off and immediately disagree with what the other person has to say. Well, what kind of a pattern does that set? And what type of communication style is that? And on the slides it says, I'll give you a hint. It's certainly not inquiry, right? What's happening here, and most of the downfalls of online social media, whether it be Facebook or Twitter, is that everyone's using advocacy. Think about it. Everyone's declaring what they think. Everyone's stating, I'm right, this is my position. And there's actually very little inquiry, right? And that leads to the dysfunction of these online communication outlets. And so if you think about it, and I love this comment that I saw yesterday, think about how many people you've actually convinced using assertiveness online, whether it be political posts, work posts. I mean, I'm guilty of this, and I think we're all guilty of this. I don't think I convinced anybody in the last election. It might have been zero, right? But now that I think about it, I only said, here's my position, right? And you say it in such a way, in a tone, even online, that clearly indicates that, yep, I'm right, and everybody else is wrong. And if you think about it, does that actually work? And how is this working for us? Do you feel better after you're on Facebook and Twitter when you're fighting with someone? Is this really working for us? And I know for me personally, I don't think it has. I don't think it works at all, and I feel more frustrated. And I feel like I've had less influence after I've used these more assertive, direct statements. And so again, maybe consider, like, maybe I should frame things in the form of a question, and maybe we can actually start a genuine conversation rather than tennis, because most of the time we're back at tennis, fighting back and forth. I'm right. Nope, here's a better article. It shows I'm right and you're wrong. And then the other person posts another article saying that they're right and you're wrong. And it just goes back and forth, presenting different facts and different points of view, and nothing gets resolved. And if you think about it in terms of influence and persuasion, I don't think any influence or persuasion is happening in these situations. So maybe, again, use more questions in these communication outlets. And this brings us back to not hypothetical examples. This brings us back to the real-world example that I used at the very beginning of the webinar, where I was frustrated with a warehouse manager who said they weren't going to accept several $1,000s worth of inventory, an inventory that I needed for a sale of Tide detergent the next day at the local Giant Eagle. All right, so it was a big deal, and I knew that if this didn't get resolved, my boss was certainly going to come talk to me about why we didn't have enough on-hand inventory to deal with this important sale that was happening that next weekend. And so I was actually able to resolve this completely in the way that I wanted to in about 10 minutes after I got off that initial phone call. So luckily, before I hung up on the warehouse manager in the conversation I relayed to you earlier, I asked a lot of questions because I was confused. I said, okay, I understand that you're not accepting these $7,000 worth of inventory cases. Can you tell me what's wrong with them? Like, they can't be, unless they're all leaking, you know, detergent doesn't go bad. Tell me what's wrong with these packages. And the warehouse manager said, well, they don't have a top to them. It's open air containers. It's actually 3/4 containers, and they might fall when we're shipping them all through the warehouse, and I don't want them to explode, and the warehouse floor is creating like detergent, and then everyone's going to slip, and it's a safety hazard. And I said, okay, fair enough. Can you give me like the SKU number so I can look it up? And those questions were extremely helpful. So I got off the phone, I started to look at this, and I started to look up the SKU numbers, and it gave me time to look this up, get more information, and I saw that the packaging, this new packaging, wasn't any different than some things that we had used in the past. So when I called the warehouse manager and got him back on the phone, I said, you know what, I just looked at some of these packaging, and I see that it's open on the top, but didn't we use this for a sale 3 months ago? Weren't they open-ended packages at the top too? And now the warehouse manager said, yeah, I guess you're right. I do remember that. We were able to use that. And so I was able to ask more questions, like, okay, if we were able to use it 3 months ago and you guys were able to handle them 3 months ago, is there any reason you can't handle them right now? And they kind of mumbled, well, okay, I guess you're right. And initially when the warehouse manager hung up the phone, I wasn't sure if I had succeeded. He hung up the phone saying, I'll get back to you. And it turns out 10 minutes later, I checked my inventory screen, my computer screen, and all of it had been accepted into inventory. And this was a great example of influence without authority. I was a first-year business analyst. This guy probably had at least 7, 8 years more experience than I did. And if it came to a fight, I probably had to get my boss involved, which probably means the warehouse manager probably got the head of the warehouse down and on the phone with my boss, and they were going to hash it out. And think about you have to play all your cards. You're losing all your chips. You're getting your boss involved for a very trivial or a very easy solution that we could just work out over the phone together. And just by asking questions using inquiry, I was able to resolve the situation peacefully in a quick amount of time, and no one needed to know about it. I didn't need to escalate this to my boss and create like a larger fight between the procurement department and the warehouse, right, which nobody wants, especially at the beginning of the day. And so this was a way that inquiry using inquiry I was able to influence somebody else more senior than me and with more formal authority in the organization. So that's an everyday example of how inquiry can be beneficial in real work-life situations that many of us face. And the last thing I wanted to talk about in the last 2 slides here is, can you actually gain influence by seeking help, by seeking feedback? And this is something we all need to do, especially early in our careers. We need to know how we're doing. We need to see that career ladder. Am I going to get that promotion 2 years from now? Am I on pace to do that? So we need to ask help of mentors and of our superiors. But how do we do that? Because there's reputational risks. If I'm asking for help too much, I might be seen as maybe needy, or why is the person always asking for help? I mean, are they not a good employee? Can't they figure it out on themselves? So there are those reputational costs. Luckily, there's a lot of research on this about how to do this effectively. One way to do this, and it's very simple, and again, it's how you frame the request. You frame it in terms of advice. You're an expert in this area. I'd really like to get some input from you and hear about your point of view or hear about your perspective. Now, you're putting it on them. You're making them feel good about themselves, right? They're the expert, and that's why you're going to them. It's not because you don't know how to solve a problem. It's because they're just so good at what they do, you want to learn from them, right? So that shields some of those reputational costs. And you need to genuinely think about, you know what, I want this feedback because this person is a genuinely a valuable source of information. You need to get yourself in that frame of mind. There's going to be a lot to gain from the situation, and that's going to put you in a much more respectful form of asking questions when you seek this help. And the third is you have to seem open or at least willing to receive negative feedback. Because if your boss, your supervisor thinks that you're doing this for impression management, like only to hear how good you are, that leads to lower performance evaluations in the end, and you're not gaining any influence. So what we want to do is make sure that you signal a willingness to say, tell me how I'm doing both good and bad. Give me, 3 things that I'm doing well and a couple things that need to be improved. And that way it creates a much more evenly balanced conversation, and your supervisor probably and most likely will appreciate that you're, okay, yeah, obviously you want some good feedback, but you're also very open to some of that negative feedback. And in a lot of ways that shields some of those potential reputational costs that can harm you in these situations. Again, why does this work? Well, if you're asking for advice, or if you're saying, you know what, you're an expert in this field, you have a lot of experience, a lot of tenure, I just want to learn from you, it immediately flatters the other person, and they're going to be much more willing to respond, and they're going to think more highly of you. And this famous quote, I forget the source of it, but we all value the wisdom of people who come to us for advice. I mean, we really start to respect and feel good about and like more those people who ask us for advice, because you're flattering the other side. It's giving them an ego boost. And third, and importantly, even if you are having a problem that you can't solve at work, if you frame it in this way, you're going to some expert for advice, it takes the emphasis off of you. It's not a problem that you can't solve. That's not even in the mind of the other person. What's in the mind of the other person is that you're treating them as an expert, right? And so there is a way to do this. It's pretty simple, but before you make these requests, make sure you plan. Like really hear yourself say or what you want to say, or write it out. Like I want to make sure I frame this as I want to treat this person as an expert and ask for advice rather than admitting that maybe I'm having a problem here. There's a way to do that. So this will be some very simple ways for you to seek feedback, ask for help without the reputational costs of doing so. So to recap the session today, there were 3 takeaways that I hope you can remember. Three things. First is we covered those situations where powerless speech, less assertive speech, is actually more effective than powerful assertive speech. And most of those occasions are when we're working with peers, these interdependent teams that most of us in our first couple jobs out of college, out of business school, consulting, banking, auditing, we're usually working in small groups with peers, and actually powerless speech can be more effective in those situations. Second, using more inquiry to gain influence, asking questions, using disclaimers can be more effective than advocacy. And actually, we should all try to strive to using more of a balance in our communication styles. And finally, the third takeaway is what we just covered is, seek advice, not help. Make sure you're leaning on and making sure that you're explicitly telling others, you're the expert here, how can I learn from you? And then it doesn't seem like you're asking for help anymore. It seems like you're going to them because they're the knowledgeable one, and it'll make them feel better. So those are 3, I think, pretty practical takeaways that you can take away from the session. Oh, and one more slide. If you like the topics today, some of the stuff on powerless speech is actually a TED Talk. If you just look up Adam Grant or Google Adam Grant, powerless speech, he has a 20-minute TED Talk with a lot more details on that form of communication. And these 3 books are very easy to read, relatively short, with a lot of information about how to influence others with less assertive speech and the ways that you can do that in a wide variety of contexts, dealing with difficult coworkers, dealing with teammates who aren't doing enough work, and you need to influence them to get them to do more work, all these situations. And the book Quiet, if you're introverted and don't feel very comfortable using influence tactics, Quiet will help you in some ways feel more comfortable with your own style for doing that.
Thank you, Professor Lebel. Great presentation. So at this point, we will address your questions. If you have a question about any of the material presented this afternoon, simply submit a question via the Q&A tab. If your presentation is full screen and you wish to submit questions, you will need to exit the full screen view and return to the WebEx event window before you will see the Q&A tab on the right of the screen. So while everybody is having a chance to get their questions in, I just wanted to go through a few slides. First is on the Pitt Human Resources Club. Any students at the University of Pittsburgh who found this topic to be interesting, you have the opportunity to join this club through Pitt Business. The way to get involved is located below. The club meets on Mondays in Senate Square. It's open to students from all majors, not just business majors. Also, if you like today's content, you can also log online to see past webinars presented by Pitt Business. The list of some recent webinars is presented below. So it's a mix of webinars from our leading faculty presenting on topics and also from alumni sharing their perspectives through a panel. And finally, Pitt Business is proud to offer a mentoring match. So any alumni who are on the line today and any business students are eligible to participate in this great platform. It's only open to business students at Pitt. It's a great way to get advice from alumni to reach out and to benefit from their expertise. And the information for how to register is located below. So at this point, we're going to jump into the questions. So we received a number of questions when people were registering on this topic. So Dave, somebody asked, how can I navigate situations where I have no formal authority, but I need to delegate or receive cooperation, especially when you're dealing with difficult coworkers?
That's a really good question and a challenge that most of us face. And I think, obviously you can use the communication styles and the tactics that we went through in the webinar, but additionally, another point of advice here, especially if this is actually like in groups and teams, groups and teams that are going to get started, or you get to pick some people, or you're maybe even randomly assigned to some group at work, and you start to realize there are difficult coworkers. One structural solution is something that, and it's really important to do this at the beginning, is to create certain group norms. So I would always recommend using some of the inquiry, the less assertive speech, but in terms of norms, what you want to do, especially from getting buy-in from difficult coworkers, is doing it from the beginning. And you can set it up by using inquiry at an initial team meeting or like the first or second team meeting, and you can ask, what's our goals here? And then by asking questions, you can get people to, quote, sign up, right? By other people saying, yeah, I'm interested in doing this or doing this task, by asking questions, you get people to sign up in advance. And so that's one norm you can do, is by asking questions, you start to get people involved from the very first meeting. And actually, that's really critical, because then there's many of us, many students probably dealing with social loafing or people not doing all their work in a group project. That's one form of a difficult colleague or coworker. You have to establish these norms from the beginning, get people involved, and sometimes it's the very first meeting, because then people know we're not just going to come in and slack off, right? We're actually going to, meet for an hour, get our work done, and then we'll be done. We're not going to waste anybody's time here. So you want to build this in structurally in the meetings, and then you want to get something in writing from people, an email. Right, so you might want to send something off after the first meeting. Send an email saying, okay, here's what we decided to do, right? And get everybody's explicit sign-off, like have them respond to the email. And so when you get people to say, yes, I will do, this task by next Monday, or I will complete this task by next Thursday, you increase the likelihood that they complete it, and you don't have to follow up. And that's something that's very, very important for dealing with these difficult coworkers. We don't want to have to follow up and have a confrontation. We don't want to have to keep reminding them, hey, come on now, you said you were going to do something on Thursday. And the trick is, early on in the project, start a norm where you get them to actively say, I will do this. And then you can just say, look, you said you were going to do this, and most people will respond pretty well to that. You don't have to nag them. So then the team is like, look, we all agreed to this, we all agreed to these deadlines, and that type of confirmation or affirmation can help the team. But it has to be done early, and that's really the trick. By the time you have a problem 6 weeks into the group project or the team at work, it's probably too late. You really need to start it from the beginning.
That's very good advice, Dave. Another question that came in from several audience members on the topic of being assertive. For people, where it doesn't feel natural for them to be assertive, and they're concerned that they'll be perceived as being aggressive. How do they approach that? How do they avoid those perceptions?
Yeah, no, this is another really good question and one I get a lot. I mean, I think and I hope that from this talk, this presentation today, you feel a little bit better that you don't have to be assertive. I mean, and so people are it's going to come across if you truly feel inside of you that this is not my personality, I don't feel comfortable doing this. Even if you're trying to control some of those emotions, it's going to come out that it's not your typical style. It's going to come off as awkward or maybe even seen as too aggressive because you're trying too hard. And what I would urge you to do is to not try. Don't fake it. Like, there are ways to gain influence by not being assertive, and I would stick to your personality type. If you're introverted, ask more questions. I don't think there's anything wrong with, in certain situations, being seen as the more thoughtful type, especially in consulting, banking, industries that I've worked in. Most people are responsive to really good questions and like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of this dilemma in that way or this problem in that way. And so I would encourage you to don't change your personality type. It's too hard, especially when we're talking about introverts. It's really hard to change that type, but play to your strength. Use less assertive communication. Use more questions, and then you won't be in these situations where you feel like, okay, I tried to be assertive and it didn't go over well and everybody thought it was too much. So I would urge you to stick to your strengths and don't try to be someone that you're not. It actually doesn't work that well. And they found that to be true on Facebook when people are trying to be a different personality type. People see through that on Facebook and at work situations. It doesn't go very well in terms of how your supervisor sees you if you're trying to change your personality type. So just stick to what you're doing and use some of the tactics we talked about today.
Thank you, Dave. So several questions have come in through the Q&A tab. Thank you to those who've submitted some live. Still the opportunity to get some more questions in if you'd like. So several questions are related to gender and culture when it comes to approaching powerful speech and powerless speech. So one question is on the topic of women in powerless speech. The person writes from experience that, she's used that a lot and she feels that she's often seen as being put at a disadvantage, particularly in meetings. So what are your reactions to, women who have that perception, who've encountered that?
So this is this research on this in leadership, especially gender in leadership, who becomes a leader, and it's really a double bind for women. It's unfortunate, but this is a lot of research. This is several papers find this, that a lot of women use less powerful speech, use more inquiry, and yet they feel that they're not getting the level of persuasion or influence that they want. So there's that challenge. So I think, yes, I can empathize with the person or the people who wrote this question, because, yes, sometimes for women these tactics can be or seemingly less effective. The double bind here is that if you go the other way, if you try to correct on that and say I'm going to be assertive, it goes back to the previous question. A lot of times, especially men, will be like, whoa, 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 tone it down, you're too assertive. And that's the double bind, right? You're using the typical speech that you feel comfortable using, and you're not getting the influence that you want. And when you flip to the other style, that you're getting punished for it. And so what can you do about that? A couple things is, if you're using inquiry on behalf of others, so if you make it clear that your motives are very explicitly about the group, the department, the organization, the greater good, women do tend to find greater success and influence. You may think that you're already doing that. I would say you may be, but I would make this very explicit, and really think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it, and make sure, look, this is really important for the organization. It's really important for our customer. You could even tie that to the bottom line. This is important for our customer, and thus our bottom line sales, right? And so it doesn't have to be, quote, soft topics that you're talking about. You can really, by really emphasizing those pro-social values, women find it more effective when they're negotiating and also in meetings. That's one thing that you can do. The other thing, I have to think about there's one other piece of advice that's important for this. So negotiating on behalf of others, I'll have to come back to it, but I lost the other one. But the other one is an amplification strategy. This is getting others involved. There's less research on this, but this is more popular press. Amplification strategy has been started by women. I believe it was in the Obama administration, and I think other organizations like Whole Foods. So if a woman says something in a meeting, let's say Anita says something in a meeting, then Marie will say, oh, echoing Anita's point, I agree with her, I think it's a really good point, and I think we should consider it, and that's called amplification. So now it's not just the one person, it's someone seconding it, and this is among colleagues, peers, friends. You have to coordinate this informally, but you can increase the odds that the idea sticks or that there's some influence by getting someone else to second that, and it's often women. And this is often to influence men, because they're just not recognizing the inquiry sometimes, and hearing it repeated multiple times increases the odds. So that takes a little bit more coordination, but I think it's a really intriguing strategy that I think can gain some traction here and get you out of the double bind by having other people second your idea and really amplify it. So, yep, I really like that idea and perspective, and it gives that idea more airtime, and hopefully it sticks.
Excellent points. And yeah, as Dave mentioned, there's a lot of really good research out there on the issue of the double bind. Sticking along this theme, a question came in about cultural differences. So this person has tried speaking in a less assertive manner. They've been using hedge language, asking questions in their country, following the inquiry method, but feels that her peers have looked at her as unconfident and inexperienced. So how does this strategy play in other cultures, that may not approach things the same as in the United States?
Yeah, so there's two things I'll say. The first thing is that I think a key point here is that you shouldn't be using exclusively one style versus the other. They're too broad of a category to just say I'm going to use all inquiry or all advocacy. A better way to think of it is, let's say you use, I don't know, if you use more inquiry and you're more introverted, and you're not comfortable with advocacy, and you say maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, you'd rate yourself in terms of using advocacy as a 2, right? Well, you don't want to go to an 8 or 9, but you want to increase that number to maybe 3 or 4, right? Increase it a little bit. So increase the number of times that you use advocacy, and vice versa. For many of us, we're probably using inquiry not enough. So if you're like a 1 or 2 for inquiry, again, move yourself up to a 4 or 5, and it balances out your portfolio of communication. So don't just use one style. You do need to work on both. It's most effective if you can move back and forth between the styles. So you should try to work on your skills for whichever one is not your natural one, but just pick and choose when you use it. Limit your usage, but try to incorporate both from time to time. Regarding the cultural question, there are some cultures where inquiry will have what we call a main effect. It'll just be more positive. So more Asian cultures, quote-unquote Eastern cultures, will be much more open to inquiry styles. It's much more collective. They're much more group-oriented in how they see the world. And there's lots of research on this, so I'm not just making this up. There's a lot of cultural research on this. So there are cultures where inquiry will be the preferred one, and you will be more successful with teams. Now, here in the United States, that's likely not the case. Advocacy is most likely the one. So I think it's really, you might want to seek feedback about your communication style, maybe find that person who you trust the most, get some feedback about some of the struggles you're facing. And what you really want to do is find those occasional opportunities where you do switch and you use more advocacy. And you may even want to present it to your boss and get some feedback and say, look, I ask a lot of questions, but I think we can frame this issue differently, or we need to consider these other things. And I find that valuable to the team discussion. But you know what, I'm noticing that maybe some of my teammates don't find that valuable. Is there something else I could be doing so that, I really care about this group? This is where you get into the pro-social values. You're doing this because, it's not because you're trying to get a higher performance evaluation. I'm trying to make the group better functioning. I'm trying to make this organization do better in terms of performance. Look, I really want to help all of us out. So what can I do? It seems like I'm being a little bit too not assertive enough at times, so when should I be assertive? Because my motives are in the right place. I'm trying to help all of us out. And so that way you can maybe ask for feedback and maybe get some better insight into when you should be using the different one. There are going to be these cultural differences. I mean, most organizations or culturally will have a default to what is the expected communication style. And if you fit that, you'll be viewed more effectively. If you don't match it, then you might take a hit. So you need to figure some times when you should be able to use the other style that might not be as natural to you.
Okay, great. And so sticking with this theme of cultural differences within an organization, we've also received a number of questions on the subject of intergenerational communication. So baby boomers to Generation X to millennials, and now there's Generation Z coming up the pipeline. So how does that influence communications and persuasion? And a related question to that is, being a younger person in an organization, the best way to go about things.
This is a tougher one, and I'm not I'm an expert in some of the other of these areas, but the generational communicational differences is not something that I think there's a challenge here. What I would say to this audience, I'm going to make the assumption if you're in CBA right now or a recent graduate 1 or 2 years out, I think the key is, especially early in your careers, find out what mode of communication is preferred by your boss or your team or your direct supervisor. And what you want to do is have a conversation early on in your relationship with that supervisor and say, I'd like to get feedback. You could even make a joke about millennials. Say, we always want feedback. We want feedback constantly, but I know that it's not possible. You're too busy as a manager. What's the best way for me to get feedback? What time period and what format, right? There's probably not going to be over text messages on your cell phone. I'm not that old, but that wouldn't be my preferred method of communicating, with the people who work for me as research assistants. So I think what you want to do is find the preferred style of your boss or of your supervisor, and say, look, the reasons I want more feedback, I think it's going to be beneficial for me and for also for my development, but you should also recognize that the person also is very busy, that manager or your boss, whomever it is, and just say that. Say it explicitly. Recognize. Show your emotional intelligence. Show that you recognize the other person's busy, and just ask them, what's your preferred mode of communication, and I would adapt to that. And then when you're working with peers, do whatever you want. Keep the style of communication that you're used to in a younger team, but I think, it is something where you're at a disadvantage, and you're much better off adapting to your supervisor's style than vice versa. Because if there are any issues, if the supervisor is getting annoyed or doesn't feel comfortable, they might reflect back on you, right? They make the attribution that it's your fault, and so I would just adapt to what they're doing. It's not a great answer, but I think there's a reality to some of these cultural differences, and I think there is some adaptation that is necessary if you're the more junior employee.
Okay. More good advice. So we have time just for a couple more questions. Another common question that has come in that Dave has touched on a little bit, but if you could talk a little more about the subject of, your recommendations for people who are not naturally influential in their speech, who are, soft-spoken, avoid the limelight. How do you recommend they can break out of their comfort zone and learn to speak up more, beyond just, kind of playing to their strengths?
Right, and so one thing that we haven't mentioned that I would say, and so I'm going to envision that this question comes from somebody who maybe goes to meetings at work or a group project and wants to say something, and they get a little nervous, and the moment passes, they don't say anything, and then the meeting goes by and they don't say anything. And then once that happens, it's easy not to say anything at the next meeting and the next meeting, right? That becomes your pattern. And so the way to break out of that is set goals for yourself. Before every meeting, like 2 minutes, 5 minutes before the meeting, write down, I will ask one question today. Right? Maybe you don't have to make an assertive, declarative statement, but just asking some point of clarification or some question. I think that shows that you're participating, and if you do that for like 2, 3 meetings in a row, now you've created a pattern such that you may feel more comfortable. By the time it comes to that 4th meeting, you want to say something like, I have this idea. I want to get more feedback from you. And I think if you're extremely nervous, I definitely would use the powerless speech. And you can practice this by writing out what you're going to say before. Use those disclaimers. Say things like, because you're going to feel anxious, right? But it's okay to kind of reflect that uncertainty, just not in the tone of your voice, but say it in your language you could say things like, I'm not sure if others have thought of this. Or, maybe this idea is out there, but, in the aims of being creative and the aims of trying to be brainstorming here, here's an idea that I'm just throwing out there, right? And then there's kind of like no harm to doing that. But I think the trick is because you'll be nervous in the meeting, right? If you're someone who's going to be nervous, that anxiety is going to be there, that may prevent you from speaking up in the meeting. Write it down before. Write down your goal that I want to speak up at least once. And I mean, I would go as granular as writing out the question word for word as you want to say it. I wouldn't read it off your paper, but if you hear yourself say it before the meeting, you're going to get more comfortable, and that's just going to increase the odds that you say it during a meeting. But the two things I would do is set goals for yourself before the meeting, early on, whatever the group project is. Again, if you don't speak up for 4 or 5 meetings, it's probably never going to happen. So you want to do it early. Just set small goals, small wins. Like just do it once, maybe ask questions the first couple times, and then build up to more sort of more comments where you actually say, hey, you know what, here's what I think. So that's what I would do.
Very good. So closing question, also a very popular question. The perennial challenge, how do you overcome the mentality, I've been here for X number of years, that's how we've always done it?
Yeah, this one, and this is going to be just maybe me going back to the well. This is definitely inquiry. So if you're dealing with someone who's saying, I've been here 5 years, 10 years, this is the way it's been done, okay, they have more tenure, they probably have more formal authority than you. Being assertive and declarative and saying, nope, this is the change, or saying things like, this change is better because, or here's the data I have that proves that this idea is the best idea or the best way forward, that's not going to work on most people, right? They don't really care about the data that you have. They don't really care about your opinion, right? They've already made up their mind that this is what's been going on at this workplace, and so they're not going to change. So combating that with assertiveness is just really not going to work. Very rarely have I seen that work. 2 things you can do. The first we've already mentioned, ask questions. You can respond by saying, you know, I understand that. You have lots of great experience here. You've been working here 10 years, and this seems to have been working for you. But have you thought about it from this perspective? Maybe from the customer's perspective? Or have you thought about, you know, have you ever asked why we're doing this? Have you ever stopped to ask, why do we have this policy in place? Or what are the implications of this policy? And then when you ask the question, they can't say, well, that's just the way we've been doing it. You're asking a different question. No, I'm not trying to be difficult here. Just why? Where did this come from? You know, where did this policy come from? Why do you think it's beneficial? Then it gets them talking and gets into their logic, their rationale, and then maybe through that conversation, you can get them to change. So that's using the inquiry. The second thing that you can do, and this is something we haven't mentioned, you have to do some back work to do this. If you're in this group, find somebody else of similar tenure or status who agrees with you. So there may be lots of people who say, nope, this is the way it's been done for 10 years. Find 1 or 2 people who have that same level of experience and who agree with whatever it is you're trying to influence, whatever idea that you have, and get them to present the idea or get them to speak up about the idea. And then it's not the older employee fighting against the newbie, the new employee. You have someone of similar status and tenure saying it, and that's much more likely. Then you're not getting in a fight with this older person, you're getting someone of similar status. And that's assuming that you need to find somewhere in the organization with similar experience and similar status to support your idea if it's really not working. And most of the time, if you have a reasonable idea or a reasonable solution, you can find somebody else. It may take time, but if it's reasonable enough, if you have good data, you usually can find somebody else to support it. If they speak up, then it's not you against the older employee, then it's somebody of similar status. And that's a very effective persuasion tactic. Get somebody, a lot of times we think we have to be the persuasion agent. Sometimes think about maybe there's somebody else who's better suited to do it for you.
Great. Well, Dave, thank you so much for your insights today. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's webinar. On behalf of the University of Pittsburgh College of Business Administration, I would like to thank you for your attendance today.